Welcome to the Cities Podcast, powered by the Business Journal's Leadership Trust. Each episode on Cities looks at a particular topic, challenge, trend, or political situation through the lens of local markets. Our contributors are members of Business Journal's Leadership Trust.
Hey everyone, this is Stephen Ganoza. Welcome to our second episode in a series called Startup Nation, where we will talk with members of the Leadership Trust about what cities are doing to attract and retain talent and businesses. We'll also discuss lessons learned by those cities that have already become hubs for startups and early stage companies, and how other cities can apply those lessons as they seek to attract businesses. Today, we have my interview with Eugene Sepulveda. Eugene lives and works in Austin, Texas, where he is a member of the Austin Business Journal Leadership Trust and the CEO of Entrepreneurs Foundation. Entrepreneurs Foundation was founded in 1999 by entrepreneurs and venture capitalists to promote philanthropy and community engagement. Well, Eugene, thank you for being here today. This is the Cities Podcast. We do want to talk about Austin in particular, the relationship between a company's culture and a city's culture, why people should want to do business in Austin and all that. But I think first, let's talk about you and the work you're doing with the Entrepreneurs Foundation and some of your other ventures here. Give me a sense of the sort of work that you're doing.
Sure. My work breaks out in three areas. One is promoting philanthropy and community engagement among the entrepreneurial community and in our companies. Back when a group of friends and I started the Entrepreneurs Foundation in the 90s, you were nose to the grindstone, and we hadn't made a lot of money, so we weren't giving away money, but people didn't understand because they were reading that we were raising 10, 20, 40 million bucks. So back then we decided, let's pledge some equity. When we have success, the community would have success. And it's grown. We just recently tabulated over the companies in the Entrepreneurs Foundation portfolio have generated about $17.5 million for nonprofits and community initiatives since we started. And much more valuable than that has really been the intellectual capital that we've been able to contribute. That's one sphere, and I sit on a lot of foundation boards and promote philanthropy and kind of venture philanthropy. The second space that I occupy is at Capital Factory, which is, we call ourselves the epicenter of entrepreneurial activity in Texas. We have a presence in Austin and Dallas and Houston, and we're both a co-working space and an accelerator, a high-tech startup accelerator. We've invested, according to PitchBook, we've invested in more companies in Texas than any other investor since 2013. The last group of activities I take are really backing some pretty extraordinary men and women who, I think their leadership on a scale. I mean, whether it was President Obama for president or Mayor Steve Adler as mayor, Julian Castro for president this round, and a new candidate, Cristina Sensu Ramirez, who's a social entrepreneur in Austin who ought to be running for U.S. Senate. They're tied together by a desire to scale up doing good.
Scale up doing good. I like that. There's plenty here. I could probably talk for 3 hours about all this, but let's focus in on culture and startup. So what's interesting is that the Entrepreneur Foundation then kind of the genesis of it was to solve a perception problem then, right?
A perception and reality. People thought that we had a lot of money. It was really investors' money. But we took that challenge that we should be investing in the communities that are creating the environments where we might be successful.
And is that using a portion of the investor dollars to invest in the community? Where's that money and that effort coming from? I guess what I'm getting at is, what does the Entrepreneurs Foundation functionally do to achieve these goals and to fix this perception problem or maybe actual problem?
Well, three things. One, we're a community foundation where entrepreneurs and boards will grant equity to the foundation. It's placed in a donor advised fund. When that equity monetizes, they then direct grants to nonprofits or community initiatives. Second, we have teams that work with companies to organize employee and community involvement programs. So I think about 300,000 volunteer hours have been organized through Entrepreneurs Foundation. And that really has been impacting nonprofits in the community. Third is trying to harness the intellectual capital of the entrepreneurial community to help others accomplish objectives. So we helped an East Austin neighborhood develop the first neighborhood plan in the city. We helped a historically black college develop a strategic plan and brought in McKinsey and Company. We relaunched youth entrepreneurship programs in Central Texas, involved 95,000 kids, raised $1.7 million on their own, and kind of germinated a lot of new programs. We adopted breast cancer providers in Central Texas for 2 years, brought in staff and training, and developed a new perspective of the ecosystem of breast cancer service provision. And most recently, for the 5 years now, we started something called Culturati, which is bringing together CEOs and other C-suite leaders and investors from around the country to better understand the science as well as the art of culture building and how that impacts the cultures within our organizations as well as outside of our organizations. You know, what we've been saying is if corporations are citizens, aren't we the most influential citizens in this country? Therefore, don't we have a responsibility to impact society and politics? And then most recently, we've been thinking, wow, where is it that Republicans, Democrats, and independents, that black, white, and brown, that gay, straight, trans, and non-binary, that Muslim, Christian, Hindu, and Jews all come together, decide on an objective, and then get something accomplished. In our country right now, that's kind of only in the workplace. And we don't believe it's all about the stick. We don't think that only happens because of the paycheck. We think that happens because of a common purpose and shared values. And we're playing with how do we export that into our community, into civic life, where we seem to have forgotten those practices. The companies, we don't try to get everybody to agree on everything, but we try to get people to agree on what's most important to us as a people. And that's more of the conversation that we ought to be having politically. And from there, then it's what do we want to accomplish in common? There's a lot that isn't in common, but let's just pick one or two things that 80+% of us want. And let's try that and take baby steps. In companies, we get things done in teams. And maybe we ought to take a little bit more of a micro approach around values, objectives, and purpose in civic life too. So look, I spent a lot of time both here in Austin and then all around the country, and next week in Toronto, followed by 4 days in Maine, meeting with entrepreneurs and talking about corporate culture. Corporate culture means different things at different stages of the company, but it's, you know, one of my friends describes it as values in action. Last night at dinner, you know, one of Glassdoor's top CEOs in America, Mark McLean, was telling me that values are constant and that culture evolves as a company evolves. It is an institutional memory. And Bret Hart likes to say it's a corporate soul that lets us keep on track to know where to place our resources, what to prioritize, and how to get things accomplished. Forever, corporate culture was seen as CEO led. It was kind of an art rather than a science. Today, we're very significantly deploying the science to optimize culture, which has great results in making our workplaces highly desirable for very competitive talent. Another thing Mark told me last night is he thought that culture was all about how we treat each other in the workplace, and that the most important factor in whether good employees stay is whether they have good bosses. So I think we're using science to quantify what constitutes a good boss and quantify how happy employees are. The impacts to productivity and outcome to workplace performance, including financial results, is unequivocally impacted by culture. And that's why CEOs and boards is starting to significantly spend. You're starting to see chief people officers at companies become as important, if not more so, than chief financial officers. In the old days, our brick and mortar and our machinery were the greatest investments. Today, at all the highest value companies, the greatest investment is our intellectual capital. I think 60 to 80% of the S&P value is goodwill, and most of that is the intangible value of the intellect of the workforce. Therefore, we ought to be spending a lot of time optimizing and making that workforce happy.
You mentioned science a couple of times in there in terms of like measuring culture. I'm just wondering, what are some of the inputs that go into that equation?
Well, one of the most recent sciences around culture is being called passive. So, passive ways of measuring and monitoring culture. It's a little bit controversial. It requires employees and managers to opt in so that their emails, chat, calendars, and Slack channels are mined. There's two perspectives of this. One is just to see how the networks of communication in your organization are flourishing or not. If we observe that there's not much cross communications between engineering and sales, then you want to encourage that, or strategy and finance. But even more importantly, we were talking earlier about how the greatest determinant of somebody stays is what they feel about their managers. There's some super software out nowadays, passive software, that gives the manager feedback on his communications with his team members. That helps us improve performance.
Can that be very accurate though if it's an opt-in system?
Great question. Passive systems are new and there's not longitudinal analysis on it. The anecdotal case studies look promising. The other science that's really impacting workplace performance and in preparation is neuroscience. The latest studies out of neuroscience are tracking employees' performance and behaviors according to brain chemistry. We know that not only is someone have trouble sleeping when they're not getting enough serotonin, what we also know is that they have trouble trusting when they're not getting enough serotonin. So you could say if they're not getting enough sleep, they're not trusting. But the reason we care about that it's a lack of serotonin is we have neuroscience that are assuring us, and there are studies which are supporting this, that the framing of certain conversations can help with serotonin release. Same thing with dopamine, the same thing with all the brain chemistry. So it is an emerging field of science. I was at a dinner for 12 people in San Francisco on this topic. There were representatives from Facebook, Atlassian, Uber, Workday, and several other significant players who are interested in the topic.
And why do you think that is? Because ultimately they're businesses and there's a bottom line somewhere. How does this all help?
It's because so many of us are recognizing the most valuable assets that we have are our employees, and their happiness, their well-being is super correlated to our performance and success. So I love that American corporations or corporations all over the world are starting to recognize the correlation between happiness and well-being of employees and their own performance. This is a win-win.
How do companies that have more happy employees eventually affect the communities in which the companies operate and that the employees live?
That is such a great question. I love that question, and I think that is the next challenge for companies in our country is, can we export some of our culture, our practices around value identification and purpose to the communities where we live, where we seem to have forgotten many of those practices. I have a mentor who's now deceased that says everything's gone to hell since we quit teaching civics and social studies in schools, which is where we were taught as kids. I mean, at least I was. of what the right expectations are of government and what the right standards were for public discourse, so that they were fact-based, that they were respectful, and that it was okay to disagree with each other. Before that, it was even you don't talk about religion, politics, or sex, but we have forgotten how to have fact-based, respectful civic discourse.
What about in Austin specifically? Is there an example of, a success you've had in your companies to positively influence culture in Austin's government?
That's a great question, particularly around the world that I live in. In the 60s and 70s, Austin, the state of Texas, and particularly the University of Texas, came together that said Austin, the state's capital, ought to be a tech center in the future. So we recruited a division of IBM. Then we recruited a division of Texas Instruments. Then fast forward to the 80s where we landed the Microelectronic Computer Corporation, which was MCC, which is a kind of federal response to, I don't know if you remember in the 80s where we thought, oh my gosh, the Japanese are going to take us over in semiconductor manufacturing. Cimatech was the next response to that. Then, Tivoli was this startup that went public and that IBM that purchased, and there was another liquidity event, so two liquidity events, and that exploded, and that created a bunch of entrepreneurs landing in Austin that had some money. There's a guy who was a dean of the business school, George Kosmetsky, who had a vision that he shared with Governor Mark White and the governor's chief of staff, Pike Powers, and the mayor, and everyone got together and started creating an ecosystem where entrepreneurship, particularly tech entrepreneurship, would thrive. And we talked earlier about how that pushed on the capacities, the public capacities, in a way that the rest of the community was saying, hey, there's more people here, there's more money, they're bidding up prices, they're making the roads more congested. We need this group of entrepreneurs to get more engaged. But, you look at it in the 90s, we were starting to happen. By the double knots, the tech ecosystem was emerging and becoming sustainable. And now, I'd say in the last 10 years, particularly the last 6 or 7 years, the Austin entrepreneurial ecosystem has become decidedly sustained, very attractive, and solidly in the second tier cities. Those of us engaged in it are pretty committed to become first tier and a third coast in this country. But that's something that the community kind of agreed on, at least all the political and business leaders. But as I was citing in an earlier example about Columbus, you now have some resistance to that. You now have an average family income of somebody in the tech community making 100,000 plus, average family income of somebody not in the tech community making 40,000. Those are big chasms, and and affordability is a real challenge in Austin and Central Texas for people that aren't in the tech industry.
So let me ask something that might be kind of a dumb question here. Should cities not have attracted these companies to places like Austin? Like, is this sort of like, oh man, we didn't know what we were getting into?
From my perspective, very easy to say no. Me and my family have benefited enormously, both socially and financially and in every way imaginable as a result of this. And many have. And even folks with fixed incomes that owned homes in what we call East Austin, which was because of really bad redlining in the old days. I can remember 20 years ago where a lot in East Austin was barely worth $10,000, where people were happy to get $30,000 for a home. And these are many homes that had been passed down from generation to generation. And that's what people had to leave their children. Those same lots or homes are now worth $500,000 or $750,000 today. It's an extraordinary creation of wealth. Now, given that too many Austinites are renters versus homeowners, that hasn't necessarily benefited them. But look, I think 35% of our GDP is from tech and tech related enterprises. The value of every single worker is significantly increased because of the demand from the technology industry. The amenities that the technology industry have brought to this community, meaning, you know, opera houses and private schools and increases to parks and, and increased coffers of the city county. Nevertheless, are there people that wish it had never happened? Absolutely. Don't we all look nostalgically on, gosh, I wish that something was still there. Here it's the Armadillo World headquarters, or, some other music venue, or Las Manitas, a restaurant where I used to eat almost every single day. That's now JW Marriott. But if you don't grow, you decline. And we all have examples of what declining cities look like and what the lack of opportunities are there. And particularly the lack of opportunities for people's children so that the children can't live where they grew up.
You touched on cultural aspects of Austin that are perhaps not directly financial, right? The music scene, kind of the keep Austin weird mentality, right? Which I think started as a promotion for small businesses, I believe, or local businesses. Strictly culturally speaking for the city, how is it affecting that kind of keep Austin weird indie music vibe?
The lack of affordability isn't only in housing, it's also in commercial spaces. And so it is a real risk. Communities need to know that to become a tech hub, more a creative hub, you got to have four things. You got to be a tolerant community. You have to have a lot of creativity. There has to be vibrancy, and you have to be an intellectual hub. Those of us who are here and employing and scaling creativity, and we're demanding creativity from the people that we employ, and we're relying on it. We better make sure that the creativity in the community exists and thrives. Austin absolutely stretched the limits of the capacity of our creative community to continue thriving. We have done away with most performance spaces for the performing arts, like acting, and we're now realizing this and scrambling to try to create new spaces. We have absolutely stretched the limits of affordability for all the music venues, and we're trying to address this. People always think, well, artists always thrive under pressure, and that's bullshit. There's no reason that everybody has to be a poor artist. We need to pay people well. And one of the things when Steve Adler decided to be mayor or run for mayor, I took him to meet with a bunch of musicians and other artists in town. And he and I were both looking at the preservation of affordability for them as finding affordable housing and affordable venues. And very quickly they said, hey, help us make more money too. You recruit a lot of industry here to increase the value of workers. Find that for us. And so we started looking, wow, what is the industry that increases the value for the services of musicians? It's big recording studios. And I'm not conversant in this space. But if you look at LA and Nashville, you'll identify an industry that can be incubated here and help that space.
So sort of back to your theme of finding that problem and coming together as a team to solve it. How do you keep those creatives in Austin to keep that culture alive? You can create a creative hub just like you created a tech hub.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's no reason why we ought not be as interesting and desirable for artists as we are for technologists. And look, already in Austin, there's plenty of actors who have moved to Austin and commute to LA to go shoot. Even when I think about it, their films are all over the world these days. So they get on an airline, and there's 87 direct flights out of Austin. So you can kind of get anywhere these days. I think there used to be like 4 direct flights when, in the early days. And we just need to spend time and money on it, like we've done for everything else we've wanted to accomplish.
So in a sense then, if it becomes a creative hub, the artists will make more money, but that still doesn't solve the housing affordability issue for everybody else. That's still something that'll need to be tackled.
Well, look, we're working on that. I mean, like I said, we identified that to stem the extraordinary rise in housing prices right now, we need about between 70 and 120,000 new housing units today. This new land development code will help us get there much more quickly. That will, supply and demand. We're going to create a whole lot more supply because there's a whole lot of demand. And we're going to try to stem such steep rises in housing costs. For most people, it'll never be more affordable than it is today. But we realize for some people, it has to be. So we're looking at housing for the homeless that are homeless just because they can't afford it. We're looking at single occupancy residencies. We're looking at small units with shared amenities and common areas. We're looking at the whole range of housing and even communal housing options to help solve that problem. And I'm sure there are, I just don't know of other communities being as aggressive at it as we are.
I want to end this on a happy note because this is actually a great story, right? Of Austin reinventing itself as a tech hub, solidly in the second tier cities, now wanting to create a hub for creativity, just like it's become a hub for technologists. And this is not without its unintended side effects. And those are things that you've identified and you're actively addressing. Right now and looking forward, what excites you the most about living and working in Austin?
Just yesterday, I was asked, why are you here? Because I spend time kind of all over Austin. It has been an extraordinary ride since I arrived here in 83, 36 years ago. I get to be part of building the tech ecosystem. I get to be part of this wave of Gen Xers who now we've become the old guys in the community. And then intentional about bringing underrepresented groups into the mix. Do a lot of work around women and Blacks and Hispanics and LGBTQ community to bring them into the industry and into opportunity. This is almost like the wild, wild west in that you want to get involved, get involved. There's lots to do. Austin still welcomes everyone. And if you were starting a company and you were from the West Coast or the East Coast and come to Austin, you would start holding on to your wallet in your back pocket because you're thinking that we're messing with you. Everyone will say, what can I do for you? And after a little while, you realize we mean it. I don't know whether it's because we're still all pulling forward together. And if we become the third coast, will we still be as generous and as helpful to each other? I'd like to think so, because there is a Texas hospitality, and I think that is amplified in Austin, where we like differences and we welcome people of, all persuasions, and we like to keep it weird.
Excellent. Well, that's a great note to end on. Eugene, thank you so much. I feel like we've just scratched the surface on so many of these topics. Where can people go to learn more about you, the work you're doing, things like that?
Yeah. So culturatitysummit.com or capitalfactory.com or entrepreneursfoundation.org. And I am eminently reachable at eugene@avporter.org.
Excellent. If anybody hasn't been to Austin, it's an incredible place to visit just as a tourist. It's a fun city. I've enjoyed it very much. Eugene, thank you again so much.
Absolutely. Thank you, Stephen.
If you missed the first episode in our series, Startup Nation,
Seattle is a really fantastic place to start a company. There are just a lot of support systems. We have a lot of incubators here. This is an incredibly vibrant and dynamic environment in Seattle, and I'm meeting with companies that are just getting their first funding or really getting past that proof of concept phase just on a daily basis here.
Check out our episode with Shannon Swift of Swift HR, where we discuss how recruiting is becoming a form of marketing, especially when it comes to bringing tech talent to locations other than New York and San Francisco. That's all we have for today. As always, thank you for listening.
This has been the Cities Podcast, powered by the Business Journal's Leadership Trust. Please be sure to subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you're a member of a Business Journal's Leadership Trust and would like to participate in our podcast series, please email your member concierge. If you're interested in joining a Business Journal's Leadership Trust, learn more at trust.bizjournals.com.